Everybody wants to see themselves as the good guy, right? Everybody wants to see themselves as opposed to rottenness and evil and wickedness. The trouble is that those glittering generalities, big concepts that are abstract, good, evil, that kind of thing, it's real easy to think we're in support of that, even if we are completely disagreeing about what that looks like, right? Throughout history, right? Opposing sides in wars, each convinced they're on the side of righteousness and justice, even though they have completely different understandings of what that looks like. The Union and the Confederacy in the American Civil War, both were convinced they were on the side of goodness and righteousness, because as long as it's a generic abstract term, you can make it mean just about whatever you want. Same thing between the Germans and the Allies in World War II. Maybe throughout history, this is the trouble. As long as we only talking generalities, it's easy to think we're on the side of good. What Paul gives us in the second half of Galatians 5 is different. He gives us a glimpse of the shape of goodness, of the character of goodness, or in his phrasing, the fruit of the Spirit. That's where we're headed in this conversation on Freed for Love. Maybe all this talk about generalities and good and evil is too abstract. So let me start with something concrete, something you can hear and experience. This piece of music, that's one of my favorites. It's one that I play when I'm grieving, honestly. And it starts out like this. Now, you might not know for sure what that piece is, but it happens to be Prelude in E minor by Frédéric Chopin. And it's one of those pieces that not only has a certain mood to it, right? You can hear the sadness, you can hear the heartache in that song, even without words, right? There's a sense of, there's a shape, there's a feel, there's a character to this piece. And on top of that, if you know composers, this feels very much like Chopin, right? When Chopin writes a piece, it goes, man, it sounds a certain way. He has a certain emotion, a certain sentimentality, a certain way of playing with dynamics and with tempo that sound very, very much like him, very characteristic. And other pieces of music by other composers sound different, right? Something by, say, Johann Sebastian Bach sounds almost like a mathematical puzzle. Something by Mozart has intricacies and point and counterpoint, but it doesn't sound like this. There's a certain character to a piece by Chopin. I want to suggest that something like that is the way that Paul talks about what goodness actually looks like. He doesn't leave us just to say, hey, you guys should do good and don't do evil. I'll trust you to figure that out. At the end of Galatians chapter 5, he gives us sort of two countering lists, two sort of different descriptions where he sort of fleshes out. Here's what the character of goodness looks like. He calls it the fruit of the Spirit. And in contrast, here's a description, here's a sketch of what it looks like to be ruled by your own selfish sort of animal desires, what he calls the way of the flesh. And he gives those two different descriptions, not just to say, I'll give you glittering generalities. I'll tell you, pick good, don't pick evil. That should be enough for you. He wants to make sure the folks in Galatia know there's a certain way of life that it looks like when you give into being lived only for yourself and your own greatness. And he sort of rattles off. And you know what that's like. It's self-interest, and it's being mean, and it's being crude, and it's being licentious, and it's being bawdy, and it's being arrogant, all those kinds of things. That's a whole way of life that's really sort of bent in on yourself, right? That instead of just saying, don't be bad, don't be evil, he goes like, this is what it would look like. These are the kind of character traits if you were given over to that way of life, that negative way of life, the flesh. And by contrast, he says, the fruit of the Spirit, in other words, what the Spirit brings to grow in us, has a different character, has a different feel. It sounds different. It's like a different melody. You can tell the fingerprint of the composer in the fruit of the Spirit. And instead of self-centeredness and meanness and crudeness and arrogance, Paul says the fruit of the Spirit, the telltale markers where the Spirit is love, and joy, and peace, and kindness, and gentleness, and self-control. And his point is to say, not if you do enough of these things, then God will love you, but to say the Holy Spirit has been given to you and is leaving a mark on you so that you will bear the imprint. You will have the character of the one who loves you, the one who has claimed you, the one who indwells you. You'll start to have that feel that people will be able to tell, oh yeah, you bear the impression of the character of Jesus. You give me the sense that the Holy Spirit is in you. It's still never about do enough of these good things and you'll get in, or avoid doing enough of these bad things and you won't get, thrown into hell. It's still always been about grace. But the way grace does something to us, the way the Holy Spirit who is in us does something to us, gives us a particular character. And that particular character is distinctive enough that a well-trained ear or an open eye will recognize in us, yeah, the way I see those disciples, the way I see those Christians, the way they love, the way they make peace rather than sow division, the way that they seek to be gentle rather than rude and crass, the way that they are in control of themselves rather than giving into their worst instincts. That gives me a glimpse of the character of Jesus. That's what the Holy Spirit looks like. I'm no expert at music, but I know enough that when I hear a piece like this, I recognize, oh, that's Chopin. It sounds like it. It sounds like the character of other music I've heard by Chopin. You probably can do the same with other of your favorite musicians, right? You might be able to spot a Beatles song at 50 yards. You might be able to recognize the sound of your favorite performer or musician or style because you know what it sounds like, what its character is like. Where we go this week in our study of Galatians is to explore what kind of character do we take on as the followers of Jesus. And moving forward from where Paul has already spent so much of his letter, saying, look, God is not saying if you're not good enough, you're out of the club, but more to say, grace has pulled you in. But grace has a way of doing something to us. The Holy Spirit has a way of shaping us to be like Christ, to be like the character of the Holy Spirit, to bear certain fruit. And the other beautiful thing about that image is, if you think about an apple tree, a pear tree, whatever, it doesn't have to, strain hard enough to try and make itself good enough to become an apple tree. It is an apple tree and therefore produces apples, right? It's not a matter of being good enough and measuring good enough that some farmer goes, I'm not sure what it's putting out. It doesn't look like it's good enough to be counted as an apple tree, but rather it's an apple tree. It makes apples. That's what apple trees do. We are people indwelt by the Spirit. We are people claimed by Jesus. It's going to bear a certain kind of fruit in the world. We're going to look a certain way. And that's always beyond just the generic terms of good or evil or rottenness or righteousness, because again, it's real easy to convince ourselves we're always on the side of goodness and justice, as long as we don't have to flesh out what that really looks like. Paul makes us listen for what it looks like. So join us for this conversation, exploring what the fruit of the Spirit looks like and what it could look like in our lives as well, right where we are, right where the Spirit has placed us. Join us for that conversation this Thursday as we continue getting close to wrapping up our series on Galatians. Thursdays at 1 o'clock here at Community of Christ, or catch these video summary sessions to follow along that way too. See you along the way.